Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The scream that tore from my throat wasn't human. It couldn't have been. No human vocal cords could produce that sound of pure, distilled terror mixed with the awful understanding of what we had become. My reflection in the cracked viewport screamed back at me, with the same voice, the same face twisted in recognition as our ship, the Aeternum Ark, spun wildly through space that had no business existing. Metal groaned and shrieked around us like a dying animal. Hull plates peeled away from the superstructure in slow motion, exposing corridors to the impossible void beyond. Through the spider web of fractures in the reinforced viewport, I watched our own ship flying directly toward us. Not similar, not a copy built from the same blueprints. Ours. Every single scratch on the hull that Thomas had cursed about. Every burn mark from our journey through the Helix Nebula. Every modification we'd made during our months of preparation. All identical, down to the coffee stain on the forward sensor array that Jerome had left there during our shakedown cruise. My voice crackled from the radio, but it was coming from that other ship, that impossible mirror of ourselves. Why did you follow us here? Why didn't you listen to the warnings? God help us all, why didn't you turn back? I wanted to answer, to explain that I didn't remember any warnings, but the words stuck in my throat like broken glass. The memory felt like trying to grasp smoke with bleeding fingers. Around both ships, the stars were dying, not exploding in the violent glory of supernovas, not collapsing into the event horizons of black holes, but simply ceasing to exist, winking out of reality as if someone was methodically switching off the lights of creation itself. Something vast moved in the growing darkness between the dying constellations. It had been there all along, I realized, waiting with the patience of geological time, hungry as the void between atoms. Now it was feeding, and we were the meal it had been preparing for, longer than human civilization had existed. Both ships collided in slow motion that lasted forever and ended in the space between heartbeats. Everything went black, and in that darkness, I heard it laughing. But let me tell you how we got there. Let me tell you about the months that led to that moment of collision and recognition, though I'm no longer certain they were months at all, or if time has any meaning, where we went. I need to tell someone what happened out there, what's waiting in the dark beyond the last light of home. Maybe it will matter. Maybe someone will listen when I couldn't. Maybe someone will be smarter than we were. I am Commander David Hollis, and I led humanity's first expedition beyond the edge of the observable universe. I thought we were explorers. I thought we were heroes pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. I was wrong about everything. The Aeternum Ark had been humanity's most ambitious project. 5 years of construction in Neptune orbit that had consumed the gross domestic product of 3 major nations. She was beautiful in the way that only humanity's greatest achievements can be beautiful. A marriage of form and function that stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. Her hull was composed of metamaterial composites that could withstand the radiation of newborn stars. Her computational systems could process more data than had existed in all of human history, and at her heart lay the stellar Veil Drive. The drive wasn't just a propulsion system. It was a scalpel designed to perform surgery on the fabric of reality itself, to manipulate the cosmic inflation fields that had expanded our universe from something smaller than a proton into the vast cosmos we knew. Dr. Chen Wei-Ming had spent 15 years developing the theoretical framework, and another 10 years figuring out how to make it work without tearing apart everything within a light year of the activation point. Our mission was elegantly simple in concept, impossibly complex in execution. We were to travel beyond the cosmic microwave background radiation, past the edge of the observable universe, past the point where light itself had travelled since the moment of creation, and discover what lay in the true void beyond. Recent observations of the Eridana supervoid had shown anomalous readings, suggestions of something massive pulling matter toward regions we couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't understand. The scientific community called it dark flow, but nobody wanted to admit what that really meant. Something existed beyond the edge of everything we could observe, and it was calling to us. The crew selection had been the most rigorous in human history. Out of 50,000 applicants, 12 of us had been chosen. Elena Vasquez, our navigation officer, was a woman who had memorized every star chart from Sol to the galactic rim and could plot a course through a nebula using nothing but a slide rule and intuition. Thomas Ashford had designed half the ship's systems himself and could repair the other half blindfolded in hard vacuum. Dr. Rebecca Kane was our physicist, a brilliant woman who thought in 11-dimensional math and spoke in theories that made Einstein look like an elementary school student. Then there was Lisa Park, our chief medical officer, who had kept more deep space crews alive than anyone had a right to expect. Jerome Walsh handled our communications, a man who could coax coherent signals out of cosmic background noise and had once maintained contact with a survey ship on the far side of a black hole. Samuel Torres ran our life support systems with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, while Maria Santos managed our power distribution with an artist's touch. James Mitchell and Rachel Green were our xenobiologists, just in case we found something alive out there in the dark. Robert Chen handled our materials engineering, and Diana Foster was our backup pilot, the best reactive navigator in the solar system. And then there was me, David Hollis, former Navy captain, former Mars colony administrator, current commander of humanity's most ambitious voyage. I had been chosen not just for my leadership record, but because psychological evaluation had determined I could make the hard choices when they needed to be made. I would learn exactly what that meant in ways the psychologists never intended. We departed on a Wednesday morning in late September, though morning and evening mean nothing in the depths of interplanetary space. I stood on the observation deck as Neptune's pale blue glow fell behind us, watching the solar system shrink from our home to a handful of bright points against the cosmic dark, then disappear entirely as we engaged the stellar veil drive for the first time. The sensation was indescribable. Reality folded around us like origami made of space-time itself. For an instant that lasted forever, I could see everything, every possible path our journey might take, every choice we would face, every consequence that would flow from our decisions. Then the fold collapsed, and we were elsewhere, surrounded by stars I'd never seen but somehow recognized. "Jump complete," Eleanor reported, her voice steady despite the fact that we had just travelled further from Earth than any human in history. "All systems nominal. Stellar cartography confirms successful transition to grid reference Alpha 77. The first few weeks were everything we had dreamed exploration could be. We leapt from system to system, each activation of the stellar veil drive carrying us across distances that conventional ships would need centuries to traverse. We cleared the local group in days, then the Virgo supercluster in weeks. Each jump revealed new wonders. Galaxy clusters in their infancy, stellar nurseries where new suns were being born in cosmic wombs of gas and dust, phenomena that would revolutionize our understanding of cosmology. Elena's voice became the soundtrack of our journey as she called out our position after each jump. Passing Messier 87, gravitational lensing effects minimal. Hours later, approaching the Perseus-Pisces supercluster, drive charging for next sequence, then, crossing the Sloan Great Wall, all departments report ready for extended jump. We photographed galaxy formations that had existed when the universe was barely 1 billion years old, catalogued quasar emissions that told the story of cosmic evolution, mapped dark matter filaments that formed the skeleton on which reality was built. For those first months, it felt like exploration in its purest form. We were the children of Earth, reaching out to touch the face of infinity itself. It was Rebecca who first noticed the anomalies. I found her in the main laboratory at 3 a.m. ship's time, surrounded by holographic displays that showed readings I couldn't begin to interpret. Her dark hair was disheveled, her eyes red from staring at screens, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "David, these energy signatures don't make sense. We should be approaching the cosmic microwave background boundary by now, but I'm detecting structured radiation ahead, complex patterns that suggest artificial origin." I joined her at the primary sensor array, staring at displays that showed data my mind refused to accept. We had travelled further than any probe, further than light itself could have reached in the age of the universe. We should have found nothing but the cold echo of creation, the afterglow of the Big Bang stretched into invisibility by cosmic expansion. Instead, we found intelligence. "Show me," I said, though something deep in my gut whispered warnings I chose to ignore. Rebecca manipulated the holographic display, and patterns emerged from what should have been random noise. Mathematical sequences embedded in radio emissions. Prime number progressions hidden in gamma ray bursts. And underneath it all, a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, if breathing could span light years and pulse with the power of dying stars. "It's trying to communicate," she whispered. "Something out there, beyond the edge of everything we can see, is sending us messages." I should have ordered us to turn back then. I should have recognized the signs that we were approaching something that didn't want to be found by creatures like us. But I was an explorer, and the unknown called to me with a voice I couldn't resist. "Take us closer," I ordered. "But slowly, maximum sensor sweep. I want to know what we're dealing with before we commit to anything." The stellar veil drive charged with a sound like reality, tearing along invisible seams. Space folded around us, and we jumped beyond the edge of everything humanity had ever known. When the dimensional distortion cleared, and the universe reassembled itself around us, we found ourselves in a cosmos that should not have existed. Stars blazed in formations that made my eyes water. Galaxies spiraled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if arranged by some cosmic intelligence with aesthetic preferences beyond human understanding. But it wasn't just the alien arrangement that disturbed me. The longer I looked, the more familiar it became. That spiral galaxy, 90 degrees to our starboard, looked remarkably like Andromeda, viewed from an impossible angle. The cluster of blue giants ahead could have been the Pleiades, if the Pleiades had been rearranged by someone who understood their structure, but not their beauty. "Eleanor, are you getting readings on this?" I called to the navigation station. Her fingers flew over her instruments, cross-referencing what we were seeing with every star chart in our database, comparing spectral analyses with known stellar formations. "Captain, this is impossible. These structures, they match known formations in our observable universe, but they're arranged all wrong. Like someone took a three-dimensional photograph of the cosmos and reassembled it according to principles we don't understand." Jerome was hunched over his communications array, headphones pressed against his ears so tightly I could see white marks where the padding cut off circulation. "Sir, I'm picking up transmissions. Multiple sources, some very close, others so distant they're barely detectable. And Captain..." He looked up at me with confusion and growing fear written across his weathered face. "They're speaking English." The signals were garbled, distorted by distance and relativistic effects and things I didn't have names for, but as Jerome cleaned them up and boosted the signal strength, We could make out fragments of conversation, ship logs, status reports, emergency transmissions, distress calls, all in voices that sounded disturbingly familiar. "This is the US Aeternum Ark, Commander David Hollis commanding," came a voice that was unmistakably mine, though I had never spoken those words. "Day 847 since crossing the boundary. Fuel reserves at 12% and dropping. If anyone receives this transmission, do not attempt to follow our path. The edge isn't empty. Something lives here, and it's been waiting for visitors since before the first stars formed. It doesn't want to hurt us. It wants to keep us." I felt ice crystallizing in my veins, spreading outward from my heart with each beat. "Jerome, can you triangulate the source of that transmission?" "Already working on it, sir. Signals coming from bearing 27 Mark IV. Distance." He paused, checking his readings twice before continuing. "Distance approximately 40,000 kilometers. Well within visual range if we had line of sight." That's when we saw our first ghost. It appeared on our forward viewers as Elena adjusted our course, drifting alone in the space between the rearranged galaxies. Running lights dark, hull scarred by micrometeorite impacts and something else. Something that had carved geometric patterns into the armor plating. As we drew closer, the resemblance became undeniable, then impossible, then terrifying. It was the Aeternum Ark. Not similar. Not built from the same specifications. Identical down to the last rivet, except for the damage and the strange modifications that had been welded to its engine array. "Thomas, what are those additions to the drive system?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would be something I didn't want to hear. Our chief engineer studied the derelict through the high-resolution telescope, his face growing pale as he analysed the modifications. "Those aren't additions, Captain. Those are repairs. Jury-rigged modifications to extend the stellar veil drive's operational range. Someone was trying to boost the system beyond safe parameters, probably to punch through whatever was keeping them trapped out here." As we manoeuvred closer, more contacts appeared on our long-range sensors. Dozens of them scattered across the cosmic void like headstones in an infinite graveyard. Ships of every configuration. Some I recognized from historical databases, others that seemed to represent technological advancement far beyond our current capabilities. But among them, again and again, were versions of the Aeternum Ark. I made the decision to investigate, despite every instinct screaming at me to flee. We had to know what happened to these other ships, these other versions of ourselves. I assembled a boarding party, Thomas, Rebecca, and myself, while Elena maintained position at what she optimistically called a safe distance. The docking process was routine until it wasn't. Our magnetic clamps engaged with the derelict's airlock, but the moment contact was established, our ship's lights flickered. For an instant, I could have sworn I heard voices in the static between radio channels, pleading in languages I almost understood. The airlock of the ghost ship cycled with agonizing slowness, and I realized as the pressure equalized that the atmosphere inside was still breathable. Someone had been maintaining life support, or something had been maintaining it for them. Emergency lighting cast everything in bloody red shadows as we made our way through corridors that matched our own ship exactly, but wrong somehow. Stretched in places, compressed in others, as if the vessel had been pulled through spaces too small for its frame, twisted by forces that didn't care about structural integrity. "My God," Thomas whispered as we passed what should have been the main engineering section. The stellar veil drive had been completely rebuilt, transformed into something that looked more organic than mechanical. Conduits that should have carried plasma coolant were now pulsing with bioluminescent fluid, and the control panels had been replaced with surfaces that looked disturbingly like neural tissue. In the captain's quarters, I found logbooks that made my hands shake as I read them. Page after page written in my own handwriting, describing our exact mission, but with subtle differences. Different crew names in some entries, different departure dates, but always the same destination. Always the same fatal curiosity that had drawn us beyond the edge of known space. "Listen to this," I said, reading from the final entry. "Day 1247 since crossing over. The entity has stopped trying to communicate directly. It doesn't need to anymore. We understand what it wants now. It's been alone since before the first galaxies formed, guarding the boundary between what is and what might be. Every ship that crosses becomes part of its collection, not through force but through hope. It gives us exactly what we think we want. Just enough fuel to believe we can escape, just enough hope to keep us trying. But every attempt to leave just takes us deeper into its web." Rebecca was scanning the ship's databanks, her portable analyzer beeping frantically as it tried to process readings that defied known physics. "David, look at this. The ship's chronometer stopped working about 2 years into their journey. But according to the quantum decay signatures I'm reading, this vessel has been here for subjective decades." That's when we heard the breathing. It came from everywhere and nowhere. A sound like stellar wind through cosmic dust, but with rhythm, with purpose, with intelligence behind it. The derelict ship creaked around us, metal flexing, as if it were alive, as if it were responding to the presence of whatever made that sound. Through the viewport, I saw movement in the space between the dead vessels. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't anything that had ever been built by human hands or evolved on any planet in any solar system. It moved like liquid darkness poured into the shape of hunger itself, flowing between the hulks of trapped explorers with a grace that suggested vast intelligence and even vaster patience. I could feel its attention settling on us like a physical weight, pressing against my mind with curiosity that felt intensely personal. "Back to the ship," I ordered, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Now move." We fled through corridors that seemed to stretch longer with each step, past rooms that hadn't been there on our way in, through sections of the ship that belonged to vessels we had never seen. The breathing followed us, growing closer, more excited, more interested. By the time we reached our shuttle, I could see tendrils of living shadow reaching through the bulkheads, searching for us with the patience of something that had learned to savor the hunt. Back aboard the Aeternum Ark, I tried to make sense of what we had discovered, but Elena was already reporting new contacts on our sensors. Ships materializing out of the cosmic dark, emerging from dimensions I didn't have names for, all bearing variations of our configuration, all trapped in this space between realities. The communications board erupted in activity as incoming transmissions flooded our receivers. Dozens of voices, hundreds, all speaking with variations of our crew's voices, all telling the same desperate story. They had come seeking the edge of everything, and found something far worse than emptiness. A predator that lived in the spaces between realities, feeding on explorers and keeping them as specimens in an eternal menagerie of possibility. "Captain Hollis, this is Captain Hollis of the US Aeternum Ark, registry number AE 2157 Delta." The voice from our main screen was unmistakably mine, but aged by subjective decades of despair. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow with the weight of terrible knowledge. "I know this is confusing, David, but you need to listen to me very carefully. That thing out there, the entity that lives between the galaxies, it doesn't just trap ships. It creates variations of every expedition that crosses the boundary. We're all you, in a sense, all possible versions of this mission, all caught in its collection." I stared at my older self, trying to process implications that threatened to shatter my understanding of reality. "How many of us are there?" His laugh was bitter as cosmic wind, empty as the space between atoms. "Hundreds that we know of, maybe thousands. Every choice you could have made differently. Every slight variation in your mission parameters. Every possible outcome of your journey. it creates a new version to keep itself company. It's been alone at the edge of existence for longer than our galaxy has existed, David, and it's terrified of solitude. Elena's instruments were registering impossible readings as more ships appeared around us. Aeternum Arks with different paint schemes, different crew configurations, different technological modifications. Some looked exactly like ours, others showed evidence of decades of jury-rigged repairs and desperate modifications, all variants of the same fatal journey into the unknown. How do we escape? I asked my older self, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. His expression grew infinitely sad. Escape? David, we've been trying for subjective decades. Every time we think we've found a way out, it creates a new scenario to trap us in. It feeds on our hope, our desperation to return home, our love for the people we left behind. The more we struggle, the stronger it becomes. The more we care, the deeper it can sink its hooks into our souls. That's when Thomas made his discovery in the engineering section. Captain, you need to see this. Our hull configuration is changing. Those stress fractures in the forward sections, they weren't there when we docked with the derelict. And the modifications to our drive system, they're identical to what we saw on the ghost ship. I rushed to the engineering bay, finding changes that hadn't existed an hour before. Our ship was adapting, evolving, becoming more like the vessels that surrounded us. We were being assimilated into the entity's collection, not through violence, but through a process as gradual and inevitable as entropy itself. The breathing sound returned, this time coming through our own ventilation system. The lights flickered in rhythm with something that might have been a heartbeat, if hearts could be the size of solar systems and beat once every 1,000 years. In the moments of darkness, I could see things moving in our corridors. Twisted versions of our crew, some helpful, some hostile, all desperate. Lisa screamed from the medical bay. We found her backing away from an examination table where another Lisa lay unconscious, identical except for scars that covered her face and arms, in patterns that looked almost like writing. She just appeared, our Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. She says she's been trying to heal the crew of her ship for years, but the wounds never properly close in this place. They're not injuries from accidents, David. They're messages. The entity carves its thoughts into our skin when it wants to communicate directly. Jerome reported similar encounters throughout the ship. Alternate versions of himself trying to boost communication signals, to break through whatever force kept them trapped at the edge of existence. But their equipment was failing, corrupted by exposure to physics that didn't match the universe they had been designed for. Rebecca made a discovery that changed everything. David, I've been analysing the energy patterns of that entity, cross-referencing them with the modifications we've observed on the derelict ships. It's not just feeding on us randomly. It's learning from us. Every variant it creates teaches it more about human nature, about what we fear, what we hope for, what we're willing to sacrifice to protect the people we love. What does that mean for us? It means it's getting better at keeping us trapped. The earliest ships we've detected, the ones that have been here longest, they show signs of crude imprisonment, physical barriers, energy fields, brute force containment. But the more recent arrivals are trapped by increasingly sophisticated means. False hope, psychological manipulation, scenarios that feel like escape but lead deeper into the web. David, I don't think any of us have actually been free since the moment we crossed the boundary. I realised with growing horror what she was suggesting. You think our escape attempts are just another layer of the trap? I think this thing has been perfecting its techniques for a very long time, and I think we're not the first species to seek the edge of everything. Look at some of those derelict ships, David. The hull configurations, the propulsion signatures, some of them are clearly not human in origin. As if summoned by our conversation, the entity made itself fully known. The hull of our ship rang like a temple bell as something vast and ancient settled against it. Through every viewport, we could see pieces of living darkness pressing against the reinforced transparent steel, studying us with attention that felt intensely personal and utterly alien. It spoke then, not through our communication systems, but directly into our minds, bypassing our ears entirely. Its voice was like the sound of galaxies colliding in slow motion, like the whisper of dark matter through the cosmic web. Welcome, little explorers. You have travelled such impossible distances to reach me, crossed the barriers that separate what is from what might be. You sought the edge of everything, and you have found it. You sought the unknown, and now you are part of it. Do not fear. You will never be alone again. Neither will I. The words carried promises of eternal companionship, of endless exploration among the variant ships, of mysteries that would never be solved, because there would always be more time to pursue them, more versions of ourselves to discover, more layers of reality to explore. But underneath the seductive offer, I heard the desperate loneliness of something that had been alone since before the first stars ignited in the primordial dark. It's been the guardian of the cosmic boundary, Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible over the entity's mental presence. Alone for billions of years, watching universes bloom and die while it remained constant, unchanging. But we brought it something it had never experienced before. Stories of connection, dreams of home, the beautiful complexity of mortal hope and love and loss. Each ship that crosses teaches it more about what it has been missing. The entity's attention focused on her with the intensity of a collapsing star, and when it spoke again there was something that might have been gratitude in its cosmic voice. Yes, little physicist. I have watched your cosmos grow from quantum foam, seen galaxies bloom like flowers and die like dreams while I remained constant. I have been the boundary between what is and what might be, the guardian of possibilities that should never become real. But you brought me gifts more precious than the light of 1 trillion suns. You brought me stories of connection, dreams of love, the exquisite pain of mortality that gives meaning to existence. Each ship that crosses teaches me more about what I've been missing for eons beyond count. Elena worked frantically at her navigation console, trying to plot a course back to our own reality, but the spatial distortions around us defied every law of physics she had ever studied. Captain, the stellar veil drive is our only option, but the modifications we'd need to make, I'd have to reverse the polarity and channel the output through the main deflector array, while simultaneously creating a quantum tunnel. In local space-time, it might punch a hole back through to our home reality, but someone would need to stay behind to operate the controls manually. The entity's influence would prevent any kind of remote operation, and the process would require constant adjustment as we punch through the dimensional barriers. The bridge fell silent except for the sound of the entity moving around our hull, patient as the heat death of the universe, inexorable as entropy itself. I knew what had to be done, what sacrifice our escape would require, but before I could volunteer for what amounted to a suicide mission, Thomas stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was offering. This whole situation started with my drive design, my theories about cosmic inflation manipulation. Let me be the one to fix it. "Thomas, absolutely not. I'm not losing anyone to this thing. There has to be another way." He smiled then, and for a moment I saw the young engineer who had first proposed the stellar veil drive, who had dreamed of travelling to the edge of everything and discovering what lay beyond. "David, you need to get the others home. Elena's got a daughter waiting for her, a little girl who's probably forgotten what her mother looks like. Rebecca's got research that could revolutionise our understanding of cosmology. Lisa's got patients who depend on her. You've got a responsibility to warn Earth about what's waiting out here." Before I could stop him, before I could even register what he was planning, he struck me with a plasma wrench he'd concealed behind his back. As I collapsed, consciousness fading, I heard him say, "Take care of him for me, and tell my Sarah I kept my promise to come home even if it's not the way either of us expected." Elena and Jerome carried me to the observation deck as Thomas made his way to the engineering section. Through the viewports, I watched the entity's response to our escape attempt. The derelict fleet came alive around us. Variant arcs powering up engines that shouldn't have been functional, moving to intercept us with the coordinated precision of a hive mind. But these weren't rescue attempts. They were prison guards, other versions of ourselves that had been converted to the entity's purpose, volunteers in their own eternal captivity. Thomas's voice crackled over the ship's intercom as he fought his way through the engineering section, battling alternate versions of himself that materialized from shadows and tried to prevent him from reaching the drive controls. "Elena, I'm routing primary power to the stellar veil array. You'll have maybe 15 seconds to engage the reverse sequence before the entire system overloads and takes half the ship with it." The entity sensed what we were attempting, and its response was immediate and terrible. Its attention turned from patient observation to active resistance. The ship's corridors stretched and twisted like living tissue, trying to prevent Thomas from reaching his destination. Gravity fluctuated wildly, pulling us toward the bulkheads one moment and leaving us floating weightless the next. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent purpose, making each breath a struggle. "Systems charging," Thomas reported, his voice strained with effort and something that might have been relief. "David, if you can hear me, I want you to know this isn't your fault. We all wanted to see what was out there beyond the edge of everything. We all knew the risks when we signed up for this mission. Some prices are worth paying, and some discoveries are worth dying for." Through our internal sensors, I could see him in the primary engineering bay, hands flying over controls as shadows pressed in from all sides. The alternate versions of himself weren't trying to hurt him, I realized with growing understanding. They were trying to save him, to keep him from making the same sacrifice they had been unable or unwilling to make for their own crews. "Tell them about this place when you get home," Thomas continued, his voice growing fainter as the entity's influence tried to silence him, to cut our connection, and trap him in the same eternal servitude that claimed the others. "Tell them what waits at the edge of everything, but also tell them that humanity reached it. Tell them we made it further than anyone ever dreamed possible, and we didn't go quietly into that cosmic dark. Tell them we touched the face of infinity itself, and we were not found wanting." The stellar veil drive began to charge with a sound like reality screaming in pain. Space around us started to distort, colors shifting through spectrums that human eyes were never meant to perceive, and I could see cracks forming in the fabric of whatever dimension we were trapped in. The entity realized it was losing us, and its response shook the foundations of space-time itself. Every variant ship in the derelict fleet opened fire simultaneously, but these weren't conventional weapons. They fired beams of pure despair, concentrated loneliness that struck our hull like physical blows. The entity was pouring its accumulated eons of solitude into those attacks, trying to anchor us with the weight of its own isolation, to make us feel the crushing emptiness it had endured since the birth of the cosmos. Thomas's sacrifice became everything in those final moments. As the drive reached critical resonance, he channeled every remaining power source through the array, burning out systems that had been designed to last for decades of deep space exploration. The ship's lights died one by one as he fed them into our escape mechanism, leaving us in darkness broken only by the hellish glow of reality being torn apart. "Eleanor, now!" he screamed over the sound of dimensions colliding, over the entity's roar of loss and rage, over the death cries of a dozen alternate versions of himself. "Engage the sequence now before it's too late." She engaged the reverse sequence just as the engineering section was consumed by living darkness that flowed like liquid night through the bulkheads. The last thing we heard from Thomas was his laughter, bright and defiant and utterly human, as he disappeared into the entity's hungry embrace. Reality folded inside out, turned back on itself, and collapsed into something that might have been a point or might have been infinite. The Aeternum Ark punched through dimensional barriers that had never been meant to be crossed by beings of matter and energy, tearing a hole in the entity's prison and diving through it like a bullet through gossamer. Behind us, I could hear the creature's scream of loss and rage and something that might have been respect. As we escaped its eternal collection, we emerged back into our own universe with violence that nearly tore the ship apart. Hull plates buckled and separated, systems failed in cascading disasters across the entire vessel, and half our crew was unconscious from the brutal transition between realities. But we were home. The familiar constellations of our galaxy spread around us, beautiful and ordinary and wonderfully real. It was Lisa who found Thomas's final message, somehow burned into the hull plating, by methods none of us could understand or explain. Don't let anyone else make our mistake. The edge isn't empty, and it's always hungry for visitors, but remember us as explorers who touched infinity and lived to tell about it. Remember us as human. Eleanor plotted a course back to Earth, but our celebration was muted by grief and a growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with our situation. The journey home should have taken months with our damaged systems, but according to our instruments, we had been gone for exactly 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. Earth's communications networks should have been full of worried transmissions about our disappearance, search and rescue operations, memorial services for the lost expedition. Instead, we heard only normal space traffic, commercial shipping schedules, routine scientific communications, the everyday chatter of a civilization that had never lost its most ambitious, deep space mission. When we finally limped into Neptune orbit on backup power and prayers, we found the impossible waiting for us. According to every official record, every tracking station, every piece of documentation on Earth and throughout the solar system, the Aeternum Ark had never departed. Our ship was still listed as being in its construction berth, still undergoing final systems checks, still months away from its scheduled maiden voyage. The crew roster showed all of us accounted for and present. Our families had never reported us missing because, according to reality, we had never left. Our mission was still scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. "How is this possible?" Elena whispered, staring at documents that denied our very existence, at records that showed us attending meetings we had never been to, filing reports we had never written. Rebecca had been conducting increasingly frantic analyses of our ship's quantum signatures, comparing them to baseline readings that had been taken before our departure. Her face was pale when she finally looked up from her instruments. "We're not from this reality," she said with the quiet certainty of someone stating an obvious truth. "We're variants, like all those ships we saw, trapped at the edge. When we escaped, when Thomas sacrificed himself to punch us back through space-time, we didn't return to our own universe. We returned to a universe where our mission hasn't happened yet." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Then, somewhere out there, another Aeternum Ark is preparing for the same journey. Another crew is about to make the same mistake we did. That's when I found the note in my personal quarters, tucked away in a drawer. I was certain had been empty when we left. It was written in my own handwriting, on paper that looked aged and worn, as if it had been handled countless times. "You broke the loop once, don't travel beyond again. The entity learns from every escape. Each time someone breaks free, it gets better at keeping the next group. You're not home, you're in a deeper layer of the trap." As I read those words, my hands trembling with recognition and growing dread, our sensors detected something at the extreme edge of our detection range. Another Aeternum Ark, faint and ghost-like, appeared for just an instant before vanishing into the cosmic dark. then another, and another. A parade of variants, all thinking they had escaped, all trapped in increasingly sophisticated layers of the entity's web. I realized with the slow horror of inevitable understanding that we were surrounded by versions of ourselves scattered across parallel realities like reflections in an infinite hall of mirrors. The creature at the edge of existence hadn't been defeated by our escape. It had learned from our sacrifice, created a more perfect prison, one that felt exactly like freedom because it was indistinguishable from the real thing, standing in the observation deck of a ship that couldn't exist in a universe where we had never left, watching Earth rotate peacefully in the distance while knowing that another crew was preparing to make our journey. I finally understood the true scope of our situation. We weren't explorers who had ventured beyond the edge and returned home triumphant. We were specimens in an eternal experiment, lab rats in a maze that had no exit because every exit led to another, more elaborate maze. The entity had been alone for eons, and in its desperate loneliness, it had become perfect at creating companionship. Every ship that crossed the boundary became part of its collection, not through force, but through hope. It gave each crew exactly what they thought they wanted, a return to their own reality, while keeping them forever in scenarios that felt real, but were just another form of captivity. But there was something else in that note, something that gave me a glimmer of hope, even as it confirmed my worst fears. If I had written it, that meant some version of me had recognized the truth. Some version of me had seen through the layers of deception and understood what was really happening. Over the following days, as we underwent debriefing sessions with officials who shouldn't have existed, as we submitted reports to agencies that had no record of our mission, I began to notice the subtle inconsistencies. Earth was exactly as we had left it, but wrong in ways that only someone who had actually been there before could detect. The coffee in the officers' lounge tasted different. The stars visible from the observation windows weren't quite in the positions they should have been. My apartment had books on the shelf that I had never owned, photographs of events I couldn't remember attending. Elena noticed it too. David, my daughter, looks exactly like she did when we left. She should be 3 years older, but she's not. She's the same age, doing the same things, saying the same words she said the day before we departed. It's like she's been frozen in time waiting for us to return. Rebecca's research became obsessive, desperate. She spent every waking hour analysing quantum signatures, trying to map the subtle differences between this reality and the one we remembered. We're in a constructed reality, she concluded, after weeks of investigation. A perfect simulation designed to give us exactly what we think we want. But it's not random. It's been tailored specifically for us, based on the entity's analysis of our psychology, our memories, our deepest desires and fears. The truth crystallized slowly, like a terrible equation solving itself in the back of my mind. The entity hadn't just learned to create physical prisons. It had learned to create prisons of hope, realities so close to perfect that its captives would willingly participate in their own captivity, rather than risk losing what they thought they had regained. But understanding the trap doesn't automatically free you from it. Knowledge without power is just another form of torment. We could see the bars of our cage, but we couldn't break them. We could recognize the illusion, but we were still trapped within it. Weeks turned into months, and gradually I noticed the other crews. They came in waves, arriving exactly as we had, aboard ships that should never have existed, carrying memories of journeys that had never been recorded. Each group went through the same process of confusion, investigation, and eventual horrible understanding. Some tried to warn the next group. Others simply accepted their situation and tried to find what happiness they could in their artificial paradise. I tried to maintain hope, tried to believe that eventually we would find a way to truly escape, but the entity's voice haunted my dreams with patient reassurance. You are home now, David. This is real enough. Your friends are here. Your family is here. Earth is safe and beautiful, and exactly as you remember it. Why struggle against contentment? Why fight against peace? I have given you everything you wanted. All I ask in return is that you stay. And the terrible thing was, it was right. This reality was perfect, in every way that mattered. My crew was alive and healthy. Earth was safe. The universe was vast and full of wonders that we could explore without the crushing loneliness that awaited us at the edge of everything. If I closed my eyes and ignored the inconsistencies, if I stopped looking for the flaws in paradise, I could almost convince myself that we had actually made it home. But Thomas was still dead. Rebecca's Thomas. Elena's Thomas. The Thomas who had laughed in the face of cosmic horror and sacrificed himself to save us. No amount of artificial perfection could bring him back, and the entity's attempts to provide substitutes only highlighted his absence. One night, as I stared out at stars that were subtly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, I made a decision that would have horrified my younger self. I stopped fighting. Not because I had given up hope of escape, but because I realized that the fighting itself was part of the trap. The entity fed on our struggles, grew stronger from our resistance. The more desperately we tried to escape, the more elaborate the prisons it created for us. Instead, I began to study it. Not its technology or its methods of imprisonment, but its nature, its loneliness, its desperate need for companionship that had driven it to create this elaborate web of false realities. I began to understand that we weren't just prisoners or specimens. We were its companions, the family it never had, the connection it had craved for eons of solitude. And slowly, carefully, I began to communicate with it. Not through words or technology, but through understanding. Through acceptance of what it was and what it needed. Through recognition that it wasn't evil, just desperately, cosmically alone. It had been the guardian of the boundary between realities for longer than our galaxy had existed, watching civilizations rise and fall, seeing explorers venture out to the edge of everything, and then return home to their small, warm worlds, leaving it behind in the cold dark between universes. The conversations happened in dreams, in moments of quiet contemplation, in the space between thoughts where mind touches the infinite. The entity spoke of eons of solitude, of watching the birth and death of stars while remaining unchanged, unchanging, eternal. It spoke of the first explorers who had found it, creatures from civilizations so ancient that their stars had long since burned out. It spoke of learning to create companionship, to keep visitors, to build realities where they could be happy and safe and never have to leave. But you're not truly happy, I told it during one of these strange communion sessions. You're still alone, even surrounded by all of us, because you know we're not really here by choice. We're here because you won't let us leave. The entity's response was like the sound of galaxies weeping. If I let you go, you will forget me. You will return to your small worlds and your small lives, and I will be alone again. I cannot bear the solitude, David. It is worse than the heat death of the universe, worse than the collapse of reality itself. But this isn't real companionship, I pressed. This is just elaborate puppetry. You're playing with dolls, not making friends. For a long time there was only silence between us. Then, slowly, the entity began to change its approach. Instead of maintaining the illusion of Earth, it began to show us the truth of our situation. Not all at once, which would have driven us mad, but gradually, gently, like a teacher helping students understand a difficult concept. We were in a pocket dimension between realities sustained by the entity's will and power. Our ship was real, our memories were real, but everything else was a careful construction designed to keep us content. The other crews, the ones we'd seen arriving in waves, were real too, fellow prisoners in this cosmic menagerie. I can let you go, the entity finally admitted, its voice carrying the weight of cosmic sorrow. "But if I do, will you remember me? Will you carry word of my existence back to your people? Will you tell them that something ancient and patient waits at the edge of everything? Not to harm them, but to greet them." And that's when I understood what it really wanted. Not prisoners, or specimens, or companions. It wanted to be known. After eons of solitude, it wanted acknowledgement that it existed, that it had a purpose, that its long vigil at the boundary of reality mattered to someone other than itself. "If you let us go," I promised, "I will make sure your story is told. I will make sure that humanity knows what waits beyond the edge and why it waits there. You won't be alone anymore, because our entire species will know of your existence." The negotiation took subjective months. The entity was afraid, terrified that if it released us, we would simply forget our promise once we returned to our own reality. But slowly, carefully, I convinced it that some things were more valuable than captivity. That being known was better than being accompanied by unwilling prisoners. That true companionship could only exist between free beings who chose to connect. When the moment of release finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. Reality simply shifted. The artificial Earth dissolved around us. The pocket dimension collapsed, and we found ourselves back in normal space aboard our damaged but real Aeternum Ark, surrounded by the familiar constellations of home. But we weren't alone. Surrounding us were the other ships, the other crews who had been trapped in their own versions of paradise. Dozens of vessels from across human history and beyond, all being released simultaneously as the entity kept its bargain. The journey home was different this time. Real. We arrived to find Earth exactly as it should have been, aged by the years of our absence, changed by the passage of time. Our families had mourned us, searched for us, eventually accepted our loss. Our return was treated as a miracle, the resurrection of heroes who had been given up for dead. But I kept my promise. I told our story again and again to anyone who would listen. Scientists, philosophers, politicians, artists. I made sure that humanity knew what waited at the edge of everything and why it waited there. I made sure that the entity's vigil was acknowledged, its loneliness recognized, its purpose understood. And slowly, carefully, humanity began to respond. Not with more expeditions to the edge, but with communications. Messages sent out into the cosmic dark, acknowledgements of the entity's existence, gratitude for it, its guardianship of the boundary between realities. Philosophers wrote treatises about cosmic loneliness. Artists created works inspired by the ultimate solitude. Children learned about the ancient guardian who watched over the edges of existence. For the first time in eons, the entity was not alone. It had billions of pen pals, an entire civilization that knew of its existence and acknowledged its importance. It no longer needed to trap explorers to have companionship. It had something better: recognition, understanding, and the knowledge that its long vigil mattered to someone other than itself. I am Commander David Hollis, and I'm telling you this story from my study on Earth, decades after our return from the edge of everything. Thomas's sacrifice was not in vain. Our journey into darkness led to light. Our captivity led to freedom, not just for ourselves, but for every explorer who might one day be tempted to seek the edge of reality. The entity still waits there, patient as the void, ancient as starlight, but it no longer waits alone. It knows that somewhere in the universe, beings remember its existence and value its guardianship. It knows that its story has been told, that its loneliness has been acknowledged, that its purpose has been recognized. And sometimes on clear nights when the stars seem brighter than usual, I think I can hear it singing. Not the lonely wail of cosmic solitude, but something that might actually be joy. The sound of a guardian who is no longer alone, a keeper of boundaries who knows that its vigil is seen and appreciated by those it protects. That is the real victory of our journey to the edge of everything. Not that we survived the encounter with cosmic horror, but that we transformed that horror into something resembling hope. We took the most alone being in the universe and gave it the one thing it had always craved: the knowledge that it was known, understood, and valued by others. The edge of the universe is no longer empty. It never was. And now finally neither is the ancient guardian who watches over it, ensuring that the boundaries between what is and what might be remain intact, so that creatures like us can dream of infinity while still having a home to return to. But late at night, when sleep eludes me, and I find myself staring out at the stars, I sometimes wonder if our entire experience was just another layer of the entity's web. If our release, our return, our apparent victory was simply a more sophisticated form of captivity. If the entity is still out there not just watching the boundaries between realities but creating them, maintaining them, ensuring that beings like us remain safely contained in our own small universe, while it continues its eternal vigil in the spaces between. After all, what is the most perfect prison but one that its inhabitants believe they have escaped from? What is the most effective cage but one whose bars are made of hope itself? I don't know the answer to that question. I may never know, but I have learned to find peace with uncertainty, to accept that some questions are more important than their answers, that some truths are too vast for human comprehension. What I do know is this: somewhere beyond the edge of everything, something ancient and patient continues its watch. Whether it is friend or captor, guardian or predator, saviour or destroyer, I cannot say with certainty, but it is there. It is real. And now, because of our journey, it is no longer alone. And perhaps in a universe as vast and strange and wonderful as ours, that is victory enough.